90 days was the whole of what either of them meant to give the other, and neither of them counted it right. Marta Halvorsen came to the Warwick Homestead in Harlan County, Nebraska in the late summer of 1886 in a hired wagon she had paid for out of the last of her own money, because she would not arrive owing a man a thing before she had done a day's work for him. She was 32 years old. She carried a carpetbag, a folded black morning dress she no longer wore but could not bring herself to sell, and a dead husband's brass surveyor's compass in her apron pocket, worn smooth at the hinge from 3 years of her thumb finding it without her meaning to. The advertisement had asked for a capable woman to keep house through the fall term, 90 days. While the man of the place got his affairs in order and decided whether to hold the land or let the bank have it, it had said nothing about staying. It had said nothing about the land at all, except that it was dry. Marta had read the word dry the way another woman might read a name she recognized, and she had answered the notice for that one word more than any other. She did not know yet that she would stay 30 years. She did not know she would make that dying quarter section into a place the whole county would one day drive out of its way to stand and look at. She knew only that a widow with no land and no man was, to most of the world, a pair of hands you could rent by the season, and that she had let the world think so, because it was cheaper than arguing, and it had kept her fed. Elias Warwick had placed the advertisement because his wife had been dead a year, and his house had gone to a kind of ruin that had nothing to do with dust. He needed somebody to keep it, while he decided whether keeping any of it was worth the doing. He did not know he had just hired the one person in the county who could read water off dry ground, and who would, given 90 days and in 30 years, teach him to read it too. The wagon came up the last rise, 9 miles out of the little rail town of Delwood in the failing gold light, and Marta saw the place entire before she saw the man. She had a way of seeing a place entire. Her father had been a surveyor's chainman in the old country and then a failed well-digger in Minnesota, and he had taught her, before he taught her letters, to look at a stretch of ground and read where the water wanted to go. She looked at the Warwick land now, and she read it the way you read a sentence somebody has started and given up on halfway through. A soddy with a plank lean to open at one corner to the sky, a barn on one hinge, a windmill standing dead still in an evening breeze that should have turned it, a creek bed with no creek in it, only the pale, cracked memory of one. Corn burned brown in a field that had been planted too high on the slope, where the little rain there was ran off before a root could catch it. And at the west edge of the yard, near a low rise, a wooden cross weathered gray, the grass around it grown back but not thick, a year old and no more. Marta looked at the cross once and then did not look at it again, because a thing like that is a man's to speak of and not a stranger's to stare at. Elias came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag that was past cleaning anything. He was lean and weathered and several days unshaven, and his dark eyes were tired in the particular way of a man recently defeated, and his jaw was set with the stubbornness of somebody who had been failing at something for a year and had not yet found a way to quit. He favored his right shoulder. He looked at the woman climbing down from the hired wagon, at the carpetbag, at the plain, steady set of her, and something crossed his face that was not welcome and was not its opposite. It was surprise that a person had actually come. "You're the one wrote back," he said. Short, flat, he did not offer his hand. "I am," Marta said, "Marta Halvorsen." She said her own name the way she said most things, once plainly, as a fact a person could build on. "It's 90 days," Elias said. "Keep the house. Cook, I'll pay what the notice said, which is little, and I'll tell you plain it's less than the work will be worth because the house is gone to seed and there's a year of no woman in it. He said the last part looking at the dirt, because it shamed him and because he was a man who let true things land even when they cost him. After 90 days, I'll know whether I'm keeping the place. If I'm not, you'll want to have somewhere else spoke for. I'll keep the house, Marta said. She looked past him, at the dead windmill, at the burned corn, at the empty creek bed, and she added nothing, because she had learned young that a woman who is only sometimes right does not get listened to, and a woman who is always right when she finally speaks is. So she said nothing about the water. She picked up her carpetbag and carried it inside. The inside of the soddy told her more than the man had. There was a rope bed with a single blanket folded square, a cook stove gone cold and greasy, 4 tins on a shelf, and 3 of them near empty. And on the wall by the door, hung on 2 square nails, a leather-bound journal gone soft at the corners, and beside it a woman's straw garden hat with the ribbon faded to no color at all. Marta looked at the journal and the hat and understood something about the house without a word being spoken. This was a place that kept the belongings of the dead in plain sight and did not put them away. That told her the man here had loved somebody who worked and had not forgiven the ground for taking her, and had stopped somewhere in the year doing much of anything at all. That first evening she cleaned the stove and made a supper out of near empty tins and a little cornmeal and set more food on the table than, the old hand said later, they had had it once in a long while. The old hand was named Josiah. He was gray at the temples, and his knees, he allowed, had strong opinions about weather coming, and he had stayed on the Warwick place through the good years and through the bad one, because he had nowhere in particular to be, and because a man does not walk off and leave another man in the middle of drowning. He ate in silence. Elias ate in silence. Marta ate in silence. But when Josiah stood to go out to the barn, he stopped at the door and said, "Lo, obliged," which she would learn was, from Josiah, a considerable speech. Before she slept, she took stock of the house the way she took stock of everything, quiet and complete. 3 tins near empty, 1/2. Cornmeal enough for a month if a person was careful, and she was always careful. A little salt pork. No sugar, no coffee to speak of. A leaking roof over the lean-to she would fix in the morning with sod and a board. She wrote none of it down. She did not need to. Her father had drilled a memory for counts into her across 100 cold mornings, saying a woman who keeps the count in her own head cannot have it taken from her. She had believed him. She still did. But her hand went, once, to the brass compass in her apron pocket, and her thumb found the smooth, worn hinge of it, and she held it a moment in the dark the way another woman might have held a photograph. And then she let it go and breathed out slow and steady and slept. Her husband had been a well man. Peter Halverson had drilled and dug water for other people's dry land across 3 states. And he had been good at it, and it had never made them a dollar they got to keep, because a man who finds water for others rarely holds any ground of his own. He had died of a lung sickness in a rented room in a town they were only passing through, and he had left her the compass he sighted his lines with and the whole of a working education. She had learned to read the fall of land off the compass and the shine of the grass. She had learned that green grass over dry ground is water speaking, and that a windmill stands dead in a breeze because its bearings are dry and not because there is nothing to pump, and that a creek does not die, it only goes down out of sight and waits. None of it had been worth $1 to anyone since Peter died. A woman with that kind of knowing and no husband and no land was to the world only a pair of hands. She had let the world think so. It was cheaper than arguing. Morning came the color of a bruise fading, and Marta was up before it. She kept the house because that was the work she had agreed to. She scrubbed a year of neglect out of the soddy. She patched the lean-to roof. She hauled the greasy stove clean and cooked on it proper. And in the hours that were hers, the early hours before the men woke and the last light after supper, she walked the land. All 160 acres of it, and she read the ground the way her father had taught her, kneeling to the grass, thumbing the soil, sighting the fall of the slope down the smooth brass compass Peter had left her. She found the creek bed dry but not dead, the sand in the low of it damp, 2 feet down where she dug with her hands, water gone under and waiting. She found the windmill's bearings seized with grit and no oil, so that a good breeze turned nothing, which was why the stock tank stood empty under a wheel that only looked broken. And she found, walking the far slope in the third gray morning, a low place where the buffalo grass grew greener than it had any right to over dry ground, a soft, muddy weep on the shaded side of a rise, a seep. A spring gone under, silted and choked, still wetting the grass above it but no longer running. She walked the whole 160 acres end to end in those first mornings and paced it off, counting her steps into acres the way her father had counted his chain lengths, and she found the shape of the trouble entire. The high field where the corn had burned sat on the crown of the slope. The worst ground on the place to plant, and the driest, and it had been broken and sown there, she guessed, because it was the easiest ground to reach with a plow and nearest the house. The low field, the good ground, the ground where the water wanted to gather, sat farther out and lay fallow in weeds, because it was a longer walk and a man in a hurry plants where the plow already is. Everything wrong with the place, she saw, was a wrong reading and not a wrong land. The rain that fell on it was thrown away by the very lay of how it had been worked. That was a different problem from drought, and a solvable one, and she felt, standing on the rise, looking down at it in the early light, the old set-aside part of her stir like a thing that had slept too long. She knelt over the seep a long time. She did not tell anyone that morning. She wanted to be certain. She had learned to be certain before she spoke, because a woman who is only sometimes right is not heard, and she had waited too many years for a hearing to spend one on a guess. The days settled into the work she had been hired for, and the reading she had not. She kept the house so well that within 2 weeks the soddy was a different place, warm and swept and smelling of cornbread and lye soap, and Elias came in of an evening to a table set and a fire going and did not know what to do with it, so he did nothing, which is what men like Elias Warwick do with feeling until they cannot any more. She oiled the windmill's bearings on the 4th day, without being asked, climbing the tower herself in her skirt with a can of the barn's last axle grease. And that evening the wheel caught the breeze and turned, and the pump groaned, and cold water came up into the dry stock tank for the first time in a year. Elias stood in the yard and watched the water come and did not say anything for a while. Then he said bearings in the flat voice of a man learning something he was ashamed not to have known. They were dry, Marta said, not broke. A thing can look broke that's only dry. She wiped the grease off her hands on her apron and went in to see to the supper. And she did not say that she had been talking about more than the windmill, and he did not hear that she had not yet. The house came around first, because a house is honest, and answers to study handling faster than a man does. Within the first fortnight, the soddy that had gone cold and greasy for a year stood swept and warm and mended, milk kept cool in a crock, cornbread rising, the lamp chimneys clean so the light went further on less oil. Elias came in of an evening to a house that had been dying by inches coming, slowly back to a kind of life, and he did not know what to do with the noticing, so he did nothing with it, which is what men like Elias Warwick do with feeling until they cannot any more. He noticed the swept floor. He noticed the full table. He noticed a lamp that burned longer than it used to, and did not know it was because a careful woman had trimmed and cleaned every wick, and he did not ask because asking was dangerous for a man who had lost as much as he had lost. Josiah thawed first, the way old men do, being less afraid of a good thing than a younger man is. He had thawed. He told her once, the first evening, watching her climb down off the hired wagon without waiting to be helped and go straight in and clean a stove that had shamed him for a year. Woman that won't wait to be helped, he said, won't wait to be beat, either. He took to lingering at the table after supper. He took to telling her things, where the old tools were, which of the fields Elias's father had broken and which Elias had, and once, in the flat way he said everything, that the cross at the west edge of the yard was Elias's wife, Cora, dead of a fever a year past that autumn, and that Elias had not been the same man since, and that Cora had kept a book of some kind, weather and seed and such, hung by the door, if Marta ever had need of it. He did not know he was handing her the whole story. He was only an old man talking to the first person in a year who set a full table and listened without needing to be looked at. Marta had seen the leather journal by the door every day. She had not opened it because it was not hers, and a thing like that is opened by leave and not by curiosity. But that night, with the house quiet and the lamp turned low to save oil, she took Cora Warwick's straw hat down off its nail and held it a moment, and then she took the journal down, and she asked Elias across the table, plainly, "May I read your wife's book?" "I'd not, without asking." Elias looked at the journal in her hands a long time. Something moved behind his tired eyes. "It's weather," he said finally. "Rain," she wrote down. "Seed, when she planted, when it came up, when it burned. I never made much of it. Read it if you want. It's only a woman's." He stopped. He had been about to say a small thing, and he was, whatever else he was, not a man who said false things to be comfortable. "Read it," he said instead. "I never could make it come to anything." That was the midpoint of the whole matter, though nobody in the soddy knew it that night. Marta opened the journal, and she began to read, and the world turned over quietly on its hinge while a lamp burned low. The book was kept in one hand, a woman's, careful and small, and it ran for 6 years. And it was not, as Elias had said, only weather she had written down. Marta saw that within the first 3 pages. Cora Warwick had been keeping a plan. She had written down every rain, yes, the date, and how long, and whether it came soft and soaked in, or hard and ran off. But beside the rains she had written where the water went. She had walked her own land in the wet, and marked, season on season, the low places that held and the high places that shed. And she had drawn, in the back pages, a rough map of the whole quarter section with the fall of the water sketched across it in faded ink, where a furrow ought to run to catch the runoff instead of losing it, where the creek went under and where it might be brought back up, where a low seep on the shaded slope wept water that a dug basin could gather and hold. She had been reading the land the same way Marta read it. 6 years, one rain at a time, a dead woman had been learning to hold water on dry ground, and she had been most of the way to knowing how, when the fever took her and a careful hand stopped mid-page, in the spring, with a note half finished about the seep on the far slope. Marta sat with the book in her lap in the last of the lamplight, and she understood the cross in the yard then, and she understood the man, and she understood the burned corn planted high where it should have been planted low, because Elias in his grief had gone on farming against the water instead of with it, never knowing his wife had spent 6 years learning which was which. He had read the journal, the little he had read it, as a record of rain that had come and gone. It was not that. It was a set of instructions for turning a drought into a crop, written by somebody who had loved the land and meant to win, and he had been too deep in his grief to read it right. If you've come this far into Marta's story, hit subscribe, because what a dead woman wrote in that book, and what a living one built out of it over 30 years, is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She read Cora Warwick's journal by lamplight 3 nights running, the amber turned low to save oil, her finger moving down the small, careful columns and out across the faded map in the back. And on the 3rd night she stopped and went back and read a run of pages again and sat very still. The dead woman had not just been recording the sky. She had been building something out of it, season by season, the way a person builds a wall, one stone at a time. She had figured the exact fall of the land toward the dry creek. She had marked in 6 years of watching that the rain on that slope did not fail. It came. Most years, it came enough, but that it came hard and fast off the high ground and was gone down the burn draw before a root could hold it, so that the land was not truly dry at all. The land was only wasteful. Every drop it got, it threw away. That was a different thing from drought, and a solvable one, and Cora Warwick had worked out the solving of it in her small, careful hand and died 3 furrows short of digging it. And Marta, reading, saw her own knowing looking back at her out of a dead woman's book. She had walked that same slope. She had knelt at that same seep. She had thumbed that same damp sand in the dead creek and known the water was there and under. 2 careful women, a year apart, one living and one dead, had read the same 160 acres and reached the same quiet verdict, not drought, but waste, not dry land, but land that let its water go. It was as near to speaking with the dead as Marta ever expected to come, and it settled something in her and hardened her purpose, because now it was not only her own judgment she was carrying forward, it was a promise she had somehow made to a woman she would never meet. She did not go to Elias that night. She was certain now, but certainty is not the same as being heard, and she knew that a grieving man told his dead wife had left him the answer he had failed to read, would hear an accusation and not a rescue. So she waited. She kept the house, and she kept walking the land, and she began, quietly, in the hours that were hers, to do the small first pieces of the thing the book laid out. She dug a shallow trial basin at the low corner of the burned field one evening, where Cora's map said the runoff pooled, and she waited for a rain to see if the book was right. It cost her something to wait. She was a person who had spent her whole life being right about things nobody let her be right about out loud, and here at last was the largest right thing she had ever held. Sitting in her lap in a dead woman's careful hand, and she had to keep it and say nothing until the man could hear it. But she had learned the shape of grief in her own rented rooms, and she knew a grieving person does not need to be corrected. A grieving person needs to be handed a way through so gently that they come to believe they found it themselves. The 90 days were more than half gone when the rain came that proved the book. It came in the last week of September, a hard, fast plains rain off a bruised black sky, the kind that in every year past had run straight down the burned draw and taken the season's little chance with it. Marta stood in the doorway of the soddy and watched it come, and did not watch the sky. She watched the low corner of the field where she had dug her trial basin, and she watched the water that used to run away come down the slope and pool and hold, brown and moving, and then still, a shallow pond of it gathered and kept where every year before it had been lost. She watched it soak down slow into ground that had been giving up its water for a decade, and she felt the old set-aside part of her come awake and stretch like a thing that had been asleep too long. She said nothing that night either. She wanted the ground to say it. She let the basin sit 3 days and soak, and on the 4th morning she took Elias out to the low corner of the field before the men had their coffee, and she showed him the dark, damp circle of held water in ground that everywhere else was already dry again. Your wife wasn't writing down rain, Marta said. She had the journal under her arm. She opened it to the map in the back and turned it to face him and set her finger on the faded ink. She was writing down where it went. 6 years of it. She figured this land doesn't want for rain. It wastes it. It's built to throw its water off before a root can catch it, and every year you farmed it, you farmed against that, planting high where the water sheds instead of low where it gathers. She moved her finger along the sketched furrows Cora had drawn. She worked out how to hold it. Basins here and here. A furrow along the slope to walk the runoff sideways instead of letting it run straight down and away. The seep on the far rise cleared and dug to a catch pond. She had it most of the way solved. She died 3 furrows short. Marta closed the book. You read it as rain that came and went. It's a map out. Elias did not speak for a long time. His hands hung at his sides. He looked at the wet, dark circle in the field and at the map in his dead wife's hand, and Marta watched him understand what Cora had been doing all those 6 years he had thought her only fond of writing down weather. And she watched it hurt him worse than the burned corn had, and then she watched something else come up under the hurt, not shame, though there was shame, but a kind of terrible relief, because it meant the place was not hopeless. It meant somebody had already done the hard thinking. It meant his dead wife had left him a way through, and he had only failed to read it. And failing to read a thing can be undone. Show me the rest of it, he said. His voice was low. They dug that fall, the 3 of them, Marta and Elias and Josiah, before the ground froze, the first catch basins at the low corners. A long, shallow contour furrow walked sideways across the slope the way Cora's map had drawn it, and the beginning of the clearing of the choked seep on the far rise. It was brutal work in the shortening days, and there were mornings the sky held no rain, and Elias's jaw went tight with the old fear that the woman was wrong. She was not wrong. She was only early. The winter came down and stopped the digging, and they wintered on the little the place had, and Marta kept the house, and the 90 days ran out in the middle of December with the ground frozen hard and the work half done, and nobody in the soddy saying a word about the calendar. It was Elias who finally said it, one evening at the fence line, his breath white in the cold. The 90 days were up a week ago. I know, Marta said. You could go. If you'd rather, I'll get you to Delwood. He said it looking at the frozen ground, giving her the door because he was a man who would not hold anyone on a place he could not yet promise. I've no right to ask you to stay through what this'll be. Marta looked out at the dark field where the snow lay in the contour furrow they had dug, gathered, and holding even now, even frozen, exactly where a dead woman's map had said it would gather. I'll stay through the spring, she said. I'd like to see if the book's right. She did not say the rest of it, that she had already stopped counting days, because it was not yet a thing that could be said. But she stayed, and Elias began, that same week, without saying why, to close in the plank lean-to against the winter, board by board, the room that had stood a year open at the corner to the sky, and he did not say what it was for, and she did not ask, because some things a man says with a hammer that he cannot say with his mouth. But the frontier does not give a thing without first taking something to see if you mean it. The spring of that next year came dry, drier than the year before, drier than any spring the county could remember, a spring where the rain the whole plains was praying for simply did not come. April passed with dust. May came in hot and hard and empty, and all across Harlan County the corn that had been planted on faith burned in the row before it was knee-high, and men who had held on for years began that spring to load their wagons and go. That was the darkest hour, and it did not announce itself with thunder. It came the way real trouble always comes on that ground, as a clear blue, empty sky day after day, and no rain in it. Marta and Elias did not despair, because that is not how these people met hardship. They met it with competence, in the dry, without speeches. And they had a thing that season that no other place on that stretch of plains had. They had a year of held water in the ground, because they had dug the basins and walked the furrow across the slope through the fall. The little rain that had come in the winter and the one hard storm that broke in early June had not run off. It had been caught and held and soaked down deep, and the far field, planted low that spring where Cora's map said the water gathered instead of high where Elias had always planted it, came up green while the county burned brown around it. The seep on the far rise, cleared at last and dug out to a catch pond in April, ran a thin, cold thread of water down into the low pasture all through the drought, so that the stock had water when other men were driving thirsty cattle miles to a shrinking creek. The dead creek bed itself, dug down to the damp, and dammed low with a sod check the way the journal's back pages had sketched, held a shallow standing pool that did not fail. It was not given to them easy, even so. There was a stretch in the worst of that dry July when the catch pond in the creek bed dropped and dropped under the hammering sun, and the thin thread off the seep ran thinner, and for a run of nights Marta went out in the dark with a lantern to read the water the way she read everything, kneeling at the pond's edge and marking the fall of it against a stick she had driven into the mud, because a person who keeps the count cannot have the water fail on her unawares. One night the seep nearly stopped, choked again with a slump of dry soil off the bank above it, and she went up the far rise in the black with a lantern and her husband's compass, and dug the slump clear with her bare hands in the cold until the thread came back and ran, and Elias found her there at the gray edge of morning still digging, and he did not say a word. He only took up the shovel and stood the next watch beside her, the two of them clearing and holding a thread of water no thicker than a wrist against a whole county gone to dust, and it was, though neither said so, the closest thing to a proposal either of them had yet made. She read the water down and back up 3 nights running that July, and Elias read it with her. And Josiah read it, with his knees complaining the whole time, and between the three of them and a dead woman's map, they held the thread of it through the worst of the heat, and never let the stock go thirsty a single day. They did not make a big crop that dry year. Nobody on the high plains made a big crop that year, but they made a crop, low and green and holding, on ground that everywhere else had gone to dust, and they carried their stock through on water they had caught the season before, and a place that had been half a wagon load from abandoned in December stood in July as the one green quarter section for miles. In a county the drought was emptying out. Word of it got out the way things get out on the plains, wagon to wagon, feed store to church step. And that was when the neighbors began to come, in the quiet frontier way, without being asked. Ada Beck, a widow from the next section over whose own corn had burned, came with a jar of honey and a question. How'd you hold water when the rest of us couldn't? And stood in the green field with her hand over her mouth. Reuben Pike, who had watched a dozen places fail on that stretch and buried 2 wives of his own, came and walked the contour furrow end to end and said almost nothing, and then asked, plainly, would Marta come look at his slope? Tom Otterson came with a spare hinge for the barn door and stayed a day to help dig a basin of his own by her drawing. They were widows and widowers and hard-used old settlers, the ones the drought was pressing hardest, and they came to be near a thing that was working, and Marta walked their land with them, one place at a time, and read their water off her dead husband's brass compass and her dead predecessor's careful book, and showed them where to dig. She never charged a soul for it. Her father had found water for others all his life and held none of his own, and she did not do it for coin either, but the doing of it changed the whole country around the Warwick place. Because a homestead that reads the water right and teaches its neighbors to read it too lifts the whole stretch of ground it stands on. Within 3 summers there were catch basins and contour furrows on a dozen places within a day's ride, and the little dying corner of Harlan County that had been emptying out began, quietly, to fill back in, one held rain at a time. The salting and the keeping she had been hired for, the small chores a defeated man had advertised for because they were all he could think to ask, turned out to be the thing that carried them through the dry year to the bank. She put down what little the low field made and the milk and butter off the 2 cows she had brought up out of poorness, and she sold the surplus in the rail town. A steady trickle of coin coming in where before there had been only coin going out. He had hired her to keep his house. She had made the keeping of the house into the working capital that carried the whole place through a drought. He had asked her for the smallest thing. She had made the smallest thing into the thing that saved him. The note on the land still came due. That was the last hard thing before the turn. It was a real sum, owed to a bank in the rail town, the last of a debt Elias's father had run up in the wet years, betting the dry ones would not come. And Elias rode into Delwood that first drought fall, not with a big crop, but with a true one. A wagon of low green corn made where no corn should have been made, and the word, already spread all through the town, that the Warwick place was the one that held its water. The banker had meant to take the land, he was a careful man, and the note was overdue. But Elias laid Cora's journal open on the banker's desk, the map in the back turned up, and he did a thing he had not been able to do in 1.5 years of grief. He explained what the land could hold, not what it had lost, what it could hold. He had learned to read it. She had taught him to read it without ever once telling him he could not. The banker extended the note. Careful men extend notes to operations that are climbing, and in a county the drought was emptying, the one place that had held its water and made a crop was the only thing climbing for miles. And any banker with eyes could see it. Elias and Marta rode home in the early dark with the note extended and the worst of it behind them, and somewhere on the west road Elias said, not looking at her, "You could have told me the first month. About the book, the water, all of it." "I could have," Marta said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about how to say it. A man grieving hears an accusation where a woman means a rescue, she said finally. "You'd have heard me telling you your Cora left you the answer and you missed it. I didn't want you to hear that. I wanted you to hear the water. So I waited until you could." She looked out at the dark plains. "And I wanted to be certain. A woman who's only sometimes right doesn't get a second sentence out of anybody. So I make sure the first one's true before I say it." Elias was quiet a long way down the road. Then he said, "The 90 days were up in December." "I know," Marta said. "You stayed." "I did," she said. He did not say anything else that night. But the room he had been closing in against the winter got finished that hard spring, board by board and whitewashed, and it was not until the following year that either of them named out loud what it had been finished for. They married in the spring of that second year, quietly, without much said, the way everything true on that place got done. There was no speech. Elias had never been a man for speeches, and Marta had never needed one. He asked her plainly, standing at the fence line one evening with his hat in his hands, and he did not dress it up, and she would not have believed him if he had. He said only that he had stopped counting days a long while back, sometime in the first winter, and that he did not want to start again. She said she had stopped counting them too, about the same time, and had only been waiting to be sure he had. That was the whole of the asking. He built a second chair for the porch, plain and sturdy, set beside his own, facing west into the sundown, and the building of the second chair was the whole of what he had to say. And it was enough. And she knew it was enough, and she sat in it. Ada Beck came for the wedding with a whole roast. Reuben Pike came in a clean shirt and stood in the back and said it was a fine thing and went home before dark. Josiah stood up with Elias because there was no one else and no one else was needed, and the old hand's knees, he allowed, had no opinions at all that day. It was a small wedding on a place the whole county would one day drive out of its way to see, and there was nothing about it that anyone would have called grand. And it was the truest thing that ground had held in a generation. The years of the rebuild ran together the way good hard years do. There was the summer they ran a proper ditch off the cleared seep and set a second stock tank in the low pasture. Reuben Pike surveying the fall of the land by eye, and Marta checking his eye against the brass compass and her dead husband's arithmetic, and the two of them agreeing to the inch. There was the autumn they dug the long main catch pond in the dead creek bed and lined its check with sod. So that the creek that had been only a pale memory the day she arrived stood the year round as a broad, shallow water a person could see from the rise. There was the winter Elias finished the milk house, and the spring Marta set out the first orchard the county had thought could not be grown on that ground. 6 apple whips watered off the held rain, 5 of which took. There was the autumn Reuben Pike, grown too old for his own place, sold it to a young family, and came to live in a room off the Warwick barn, and sharpen every blade on the place, and read the sky beside Marta of an evening, and the winter Ada Beck's man died, and Ada came to stay, and never quite left. And the two widows kept the journal between them some seasons when Marta's own eyes began, late, to tire at the small hand. There was the day the general store woman in Delwood, who had once watched Marta ride in a stranger and had said the name Warwick in the low way of the already decided, walked out onto the boardwalk to ask her plainly what she thought the season would do, and listened to the answer. Steady work, steady years, water caught where water had only been lost. The place settled into prosperity the way it had once settled into ruin, quietly, a season at a time, until one day a person looked up and saw it had happened. The far field made corn every year now, dry season and wet, because it held its own water and did not depend on the sky's mercy. The stock never went thirsty. The orchard came into bearing. And people in the rail town who had said the name Warwick in the low way of the already decided began to say it a different way, and the general store woman who had watched Marta through the glass began instead to ask her opinion on the weather and the water, because it turned out the Halvorsen widow was always right when she finally spoke. She never stopped carrying her dead husband's brass compass in her apron. It went smoother yet at the hinge from 30 years of her thumb finding it, and she sighted every ditch and furrow and pond she ever dug down the line of it, and she taught the reading of it, in time, to a girl the Ottersons fostered, passing the knowing on the way it had been passed to her. Because knowing that is not passed on dies with the hand that holds it, and she had spent her whole life refusing to let good knowing die. And she never stopped keeping Cora Warwick's journal. She added to it now in a second hand that ran on under the first, with no blank page between them, new rains, new basins, new years of where the water went. Because a thing that is carried forward does not leave gaps. The inheritance on that place was never cash. It was knowledge and intention and one careful woman's hand teaching another careful woman's eye across the space of a grave how to read a wasting land into a holding one. The drought years came and went across those 3 decades the way they always will on the high plains. And every time one came, the county remembered the Warwick place, because in the dry years it was the green one, the one whose water held, the one whose creek did not fail while others failed. Men who had laughed at a woman climbing a windmill tower in her skirt with a can of grease came, in the bad years, to stand at her fence and ask how a person held water on dry ground, and she told them. Plainly, once, as a fact, they could build on, and never charged them a thing, and the whole stretch of Harlan County learned, slowly, one held rain at a time, to farm with the water instead of against it, and it never went back to being the empty dying country it had been the evening she first came up the rise and read it wrong side up in a hired wagon. 30 years later a traveler stopped on the west road to water his horse at a broad, clear pond that stood where a dead creek had been, in the shade of an orchard nobody had believed could grow on that ground, on a homestead the whole county had by then long called a legend, the place that never went dry. There was an old woman out at the pond's edge, working a sod check with the same economy of motion she must have had at 32, a brass surveyor's compass in her apron pocket worn smooth at the hinge, and up beside the whitewashed house 2 plain chairs faced west, one of them empty now, kept as clean and cared for as any dead man's tools. The traveler tipped his hat and asked her who owned this place. The old woman straightened and looked out at the standing water in the bearing orchard and the green far field holding its own rain the way a dead woman had drawn it 30 years before, and she was quiet a while, filing the question away the way she had filed everything away her whole long life. A man hired me to keep his house for 90 days, she said at last. I read the rest of it myself. She was 32 when she came up the last rise into Harlan County with a carpetbag and her husband's compass, and Josiah had watched her climb down without waiting to be helped, and Elias Warwick had learned board by board and furrow by furrow and held rein by held rein to read the land she read. The sun went down gold over the water she had caught, and the old woman put her hand flat on the sod check she had built, the way a man once stood in the yard and watched water come up into a dry tank and learned that a thing can look broke that is only dry. The frontier never handed anyone a thing, but it kept, quietly, whatever a steady hand was willing to carry forward. And a widow the whole world had hired for 90 days of housekeeping had stayed 30 years and carried forward more than any of them, a dead woman's map, a dead man's line, and her own long refusal to let good knowing die, and she had made a dying homestead a legend. One held season at a time, without ever once raising her voice.